So today we have a couple things to finish up from Tuesday's class about principles of restorationism, and then we'll move into some of the backgrounds to think about the Restoration in America and see where that came from. Because I believe there's some important things both in European culture as well as American culture that are important for how the Restoration movement develops and grows. So, looks like Blackboard's still going to run a little slow for us. Anytime anyone changes slides, there we go. So we finished up on Tuesday with talking about negative things, kind of what the Restoration movement was against, denominationalism, just the use of names to separate God's people, creedalism, the use of statements of faith as tests of fellowship. Certainly, I think that probably a lot of the early Restoration leaders would have said, sometimes you need to lay out what you believe, but to use that as something separate from the Bible to try and judge whether somebody is faithful or not, it's problematic because creeds are human inventions. Right? Yes, they might be based on Scripture, but they are things that human beings have put together. And then anti-elitism, the kind of rejection of the clerical class or the professional ministry, which at the early 19th century was often well-to-do, separated both economically and sometimes psychologically, spiritually from the common people. So that's kind of a negative part of some key concepts. Let's look more at some of the positive things. What were some of the Restorationist leaders for? One of the key things was the importance of Scripture alone. And Scripture alone as being the standard by which you judge faith and practice. So instead of an appeal to traditions of Christianity or really even an appeal to reason, reason had to be guided by Scripture. So something has to be in the Bible in order to make it important. They didn't say that there can't be matters of opinion, but as far as what the church should practice, what the church should believe, it should be guided by Scripture. And so the Bible alone is what was necessary, but more than that was also the claim, which was unique at the time, to some extent, that the Bible could be understood by people themselves. They didn't need a minister, a priest, or somebody like that to explain it to them, that they could determine it on their own. Another important concept that has guided the Restoration movement is a desire for unity. And particularly, the belief has been that when people understand the Bible, and when it's rightly understood and is put into practice, that is going to bring about the unity of Christians. That so much division that they saw back then in the 19th century was caused by things that were independent of Scripture. The names of different denominational groups, the creeds or confessions of faith, those kind of things were the elements of which had fractured Christianity. And so when you just got back to the Bible, when everybody understood it, then that would be the way to bring about unity. Now, of course, there's some place for matters of opinion, but what always becomes the difficulty is one person's matter of opinion is another person's matter of doctrine. So it's often difficult to try and say, right, oh, that's a matter of opinion. No, that's a key belief. So even though restorationists wanted unity, they often found division. A third element of restoration related to both Scripture and unity was that the way that you determined what should be binding on the church, especially the contemporary church, was based on the commands of Scripture and the approved precedents or the examples of particularly the apostles. So if Christ commanded it, then it needed to be followed. And especially important was if you saw in the New Testament the apostles doing it. So when Jesus says, for example, in communion, establishment of the Lord's Supper, he says, "Do this in remembrance of me." Right? There's a command in it. Right? Take the bread, take the cup. But in that command, there isn't a statement about when or other things, and so restoration said. But when you look at something like Acts chapter 20, you see the example of Paul is taking it on the first day of the week. Right. So the command and then the examples become very important. So not only what the apostles and Christ commanded, but also what was the example that they demonstrated. And then the final key that I want to emphasize and probably some more we could add, but very important for early restorationism was the negative regulative principle. Now, another way to think about that is the view that, or it has to do with views regarding scriptural silence. When Scripture doesn't talk about something, how do you approach that? So the negative regulative principle has to do with scriptural silence. So there are a lot of things that Scripture is silent about. The question then becomes, is that silence in some ways prohibitive, or does it mean that there's some freedom there for the Christian to determine, or the church to determine, what should be done? Now, prior to the Reformation, scriptural silence wasn't really an issue, because often a lot of Catholics would have appealed to, and Orthodox Christians would have appealed to the tradition of the church. You know, what has the church done? And so even where there were places where it wasn't talked about in Scripture, often early Christians or other leaders of Catholicism had said some things. But by the time of the Reformation, with the Reformation focused on the importance of Scripture alone being your guide, there were a couple of different approaches. One of the approaches was largely shaped by Martin Luther, an important reformer. And his basic approach to silence in the Scriptures was, if an action isn't specifically prohibited in Scripture, then it is free for the Christians to do as long as it does not violate or undermine biblical principles. Short. So for Luther, if the Bible doesn't prohibit it, specifically condemn something, then a Christian is free to do that action in worship or in their personal lives, provided it doesn't undermine another biblical principle. So, for example, you're free to do an action that isn't prohibited, provided it doesn't undermine the love you're supposed to have for your brothers and sisters. Right? And that's a key principle in Scripture. And so if it doesn't violate that and it's not prohibited, you're free to do it. So for Luther, that could be something like continuing to use candles in worship, like was common within Catholicism. Right? There was nothing in Scripture that prohibited the use of candles, and it does not seem to undermine love, fellowship, unity, other types of things for that matter. Well, for Luther, he didn't have a problem with instruments because there wasn't a clear command against the instrument. And so that was how Luther approached it. Calvin, on the other hand, his approach is more vague, whereas his comment was, what the church practices must be in, let me quote this here, positive accord with Scripture and must be limited by the teaching of Scripture. And you say, how does that help me? Right? I mean, that's a very vague approach when it comes to silence. My guess is what Calvin means by that is similar to what Luther's saying, in that the things that we do should be, guided by Scripture.
Repeat that one more time.
Sure. But the church practices must be in positive accord with Scripture and must be limited by the teaching of Scripture. So it has to be in agreement with Scripture, and Scripture has to limit it. Any one particular item, like clearly brought up the instrument, well, what do you do with that? I mean, if that's your guideline, silence doesn't seem to really help you one way or the other. Where Luther would say, God didn't specifically prohibit it, but essentially it's kind of this middle approach. On the other hand, and this is the approach that the Restoration movement has mostly taken historically, is the approach advanced by a reformer named Swingley. His approach was the negative approach, where Luther said as long as it's not prohibited, it is okay. Zwingli was, unless it was specifically authorized in Scripture, then it was forbidden. And so the belief is that God is going to positively tell us what to do. And if he doesn't, then that's not something that's authorized. Now, for Zwingli used that to get rid of things like instrumental music. And because instrumental music, singing is approved, but playing is not. But Zwingli then also, in the churches that were influenced by him, got rid of all music, which, there's clear examples, there's clear commands about singing, so I don't know how he get rid of all music, but he did use that to ban the instrument. He wouldn't have used candles like Luther would have. There were some other things that he was against because it wasn't promoted. However, Zwingli wasn't entirely consistent in this issue, because one issue that some of his followers brought up was the case of infant baptism. Now, those that would support the baptism of infants might appeal to the household baptisms found in the book of Acts. But when you look at that, it's not clear whether those households necessarily included infants. Right? And so followers of Zwingli said, infant baptism doesn't seem to be approved in Scripture, yet Zwingli still supported infant baptism. And so even he wasn't completely consistent on his principles. But essentially those are kind of the main views with the Restoration movement following the Zwingli approach.
I had learned in one of my other classes that Zwingli, was his name, yeah, and Martin Luther had differences on the Lord's Supper, like the practices of that.
Yeah, Luther didn't completely accept the Catholic view of the bread and the cup become the actual body and the actual blood in the observance of communion. But he still argued that Christ's body and blood were present in taking of communion. Zwingli, on the other hand, said it's just symbolic. Right? Christ's body isn't in the bread and his blood isn't in the cup. And they actually, Luther starts off in Germany, Zwingli starts off in Switzerland. But eventually, of course, they come in contact with each other. And so they meet to discuss these things. And there's like 15 items they've met to discuss. And they agree on 14 of them. And then 15 has to do with communion. And there's like 6 points under that. And they agree with like 5 or 6 of them. But it's that issue of whether or not Jesus is bodily or physically present, spirit, however you want to put it. And so that's like, you're so close. But Luther wouldn't extend his hand to Zwingli after they got done with that. That one issue was enough to you have a different spirit, is what Luther said to him. Let's look at a couple. Well, so before we get to that, let's briefly talk about silence, because silence is kind of problematic. In some cases, we can see where silence would be exclusionary to some extent. Right? So if God says, like when He's telling Noah, build the ark out of gopher wood or cypress wood, depending on the translation, He doesn't have to say, not oak, not pine, right? Because He said gopher wood. When He says the Levites, it's the priests are coming from the Levites, He doesn't have to say, and they're not coming from Judah, right? So some things it's clear when He has specifically said. So in other cases, though, if you would be absolutely consistent on a negative principle regarding silence, could you have songbooks, PowerPoint, right? Things that didn't exist, but Scripture doesn't say, in the 21st century, thou shalt use PowerPoint, right? So in some cases, things just didn't exist at the time, so maybe Scripture doesn't talk about it because it didn't exist. Or it wasn't an issue, right? Scripture in the New Testament doesn't talk about abortion. Abortion existed at the time. Did that mean the New Testament people supported abortion? I don't think they would have. And I think there's historical evidence to say, why. But it might not have been an issue at any of the churches that Paul wrote to, for example, right? So silence becomes difficult to, by itself, say, right? One way or the other. Because sometimes it could be something that was just not talked about, something that didn't exist, something that wasn't a problem, or it could be in the case where God specifically says, use this type of wood, these people are supposed to be the priests, something like that. So you have to, if you're trying to understand a passage in Scripture or an issue, you have to use more than just silence. You have to think about a little bit some other things as well. So there's positive and negative things about all of those approaches when it comes to silence. What are some other things that were important key markers in Restorationism regarding ecclesiology or thoughts about church?